But thank you guys so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have really awesome panelists. We're waiting on one more, Rebecca. She might come a little bit later. We'll make sure to introduce her when she does come in. But my name's Haley. I'm one of the strategic campus recruiters at the University of Michigan. And I'll go ahead and let Sam introduce himself as well.
Hey everyone, I'm glad that you could make it, and I'm super excited for this panel. My name is Sam Bigley. I'm a Peace Corps recruiter at Michigan State University, in addition to Caitlin Barker, who unfortunately couldn't make it.
Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly as well?
Hi, I'm Hannah. I am the other recruiter at the University of Michigan.
So like I said, we have really great panelists who were great to join us today. I was wondering if you guys could just introduce yourself, including like where and when you served in the Peace Corps and what your position was in the Peace Corps as well. I don't know, whoever wants to start off. Sorry, we can switch around.
I'll go really quick, I guess. So hi everybody, my name is Chad Papa. I served in Senegal from 2012 to 2014, and I served as an agroforestry extension agent.
I'm Stevie Riley. I was an agricultural volunteer in Tanzania from 2012 to 2014 as well.
My name's Anna Seifert. I was a community environmental conservationist in Panama from 2018 to 2020.
Awesome, thank you guys so much. And so would you guys be able to tell us also why you decided to join the Peace Corps, and in particular, why you decided to sign up for a position in the agricultural or environment sector, and what your experience was related to this before joining the Peace Corps?
Yeah, sure. I can go first. I feel like Peace Corps felt like a very distant thing for me for a long time. Like, I feel like it was something that people talked about in like movies. But my sister, who is about 4 years older than me, did Peace Corps when she graduated college. And it was really cool to see that it was like, actually, I was like, oh, I could do this. Like, this seems doable. And I thought about it for a long time. And ultimately, I was just kind of like so brought in by hearing about her experiences and the things she learned that I really wanted to be able to do it for myself. Before Peace Corps, I was an environmental studies undergraduate in college. So I was pretty focused on environmental work, and then worked in outdoor education for a while, and like nature education. So it felt like a really good fit. And Panama, I think, has a really robust environmental volunteer program. And I really wanted to be able to polish up my Spanish. So I applied specifically for that position.
Awesome, that's great.
Well, I tried to join Peace Corps right out of high school, but they want you to be kind of, knowledgeable and useful as a human being before you jump in. So I was told to wait. But my family's always been very service oriented, and I knew I wanted to travel and see other cultures. So that was why I inevitably joined Peace Corps after school. And my degree also is in environmental education and outdoor recreation. So it fit really well with doing environmental education in Tanzania.
When it comes regarding to my experience kind of with joining Peace Corps, I studied ecology as an undergraduate, like in physiology, and also briefly worked as a research horticulturist prior to leaving for Peace Corps. But I think what really attracted me to the idea of Peace Corps broadly was when I was an undergrad, I had this kind of vague idea of wanting to work internationally, wanting to have some sort of like service focus with my career. I had a roommate that dragged me to a panel kind of like this one. And there was a Peace Corps recruiter at that panel. There was also folks from like AmeriCorps and Teach for America and kind of the whole host of other service-based organizations. And I really was attracted to the idea of going somewhere and kind of going on this adventure, being able to use what I was studying professionally and also kind of as an avenue to try to like make an impact somewhere.
Nice. Thank you guys for sharing those experiences. And it's always great to hear, how someone becomes interested in the Peace Corps and eventually makes their way to volunteer, and especially like the invitation that you get. I feel like we all have stories about that. But given those backgrounds and your interests, can you describe the work that you did in your primary position or role in the Peace Corps?
I can jump in really quick. So my role was an agroforestry extension agent. So kind of broadly, we worked in the food security space. So oftentimes you'll see across like the tropics or the global south, whatever you want to call it, that agricultural systems oftentimes incorporate like trees, animals, other things kind of outside of how we view maybe Western agricultural systems. So as an agroforestry extension agent, our primary goal was kind of in the space of like orchard establishment, orchard management, and helping local groups, farmers, individuals with a mixture of being able to either produce more food on like an annual cycle, as well as maybe producing food for sale as well to help the household also access food throughout like maybe the dry season or other times of the year. So as far as my position, we kind of oversaw like a trainer's model, as well as a variety of kind of like seasonal trainings where depending on the seasonality throughout the year, we were either working with farmers on nursery establishment, nursery maintenance of everything from seed propagation to like acquiring like planting materials, and then everything on up through outplanting of trees, mature orchard management, so things like pruning, other types of like fertilizing, irrigation kind of stuff like that. And then a big focus on tree grafting as well. So just kind of briefly, if you ever wonder why all the fruit at the grocery store kind of looks the same, oftentimes it's a genetic clone of themselves. And so we're able to essentially take these genetic clones, we call them scions, physically graft them onto another tree, and then that tree then produces a similar fruit to where we took that clipping from. And so that's a way to, one, increase the production, the amount of time of the year you're producing fruit as well. And so that was kind of a large like extension practice that we worked on, specifically targeting food security. And then outside of that, we extended other types of like agroforestry practices, generally kind of focusing on maybe like soil conservation, biodiversity, or like a whole host of other ecosystem services that trees might provide to like an agrarian or agricultural system.
I mean, I can go next. Mine was way less structured than that. If you're an agricultural volunteer in Tanzania, they kind of give you basic training and then say, go find out what your village needs. So my work was, the volunteer before me put in a well for the village. I spent most of my service, my primary project was farmers field schools. So I revamped some old curriculum I found, and we did a series of classes because the majority of my village was subsistence farming in an area that's not good for anything really. So we did a lot of work on organic fertilizers and organic pesticides. They use a lot of chemical everything, which just depletes the soil and is just harmful to everyone. So we did a lot of organic stuff, improved planting techniques, how to, even just basic spacing of crops and intermixing of crops and rotation of crops. Really, really basic stuff. And that was my primary project.
Yeah, I would say so. In Panama, you have a pretty established kind of system, and so much of the primary projects of volunteers is guided by your partnership with a government agency. So I worked really heavily with a group called Mi Ambiente, which was like the Panamanian federal environmental agency, and we mostly were using projects that they had kind of started to develop or that they had developed with the Peace Corps system. A big project, well, there were kind of like several large buckets of projects that volunteers would do. Some people installed solar panels in communities that didn't have electricity. My primary project was something called eco stoves, which was essentially kind of like a clay brick stove. So many people in my community use traditional cooking methods to cook a lot of foods, which are not very efficient in terms of like firewood usage, and also can cause a lot of asthma problems. So kind of creating these stoves that more efficiently use firewood, which also kind of tied into reducing wood use and maintaining the water table around the canal. But there were also a lot of people who focused on like establishing environmental management groups within their communities. Waste management was a big part, so we didn't have any trash services. I like did some organizing around that, and then I also worked a lot with the government school system, doing environmental education in the local school.
Great. Thank you guys for sharing. I think this is one of the reasons I love panels. It really highlights just how different it is from country to country and even position to position, as Anna was saying, just even within Panama itself. So obviously, like I know it sounds like a lot of your work was in your primary project, but a lot of work in the Peace Corps is really with secondary projects as well. Would you guys be able to talk about any secondary projects you did during service and kind of how and why you got those started? And also really quickly, if you guys have any questions in the meantime, feel free to just like raise your hand or pop them in the chat as well. Awesome.
I can talk about my secondary projects. Where I was in Tanzania, there was no electricity, there were no paved roads, there was no plumbing, nothing. So we did a lot of rainwater catchment work. So we installed 2 rainwater catchment systems on the primary school, so the kids didn't have, that was like part of their school day, was go fetching water for the entire school and the teachers. So we installed a rainwater catchment system so they wouldn't have to spend half their day collecting water. We also did a lot of home rainwater catchment system, I don't know what to call them, seminars at people's houses, building cement, basically giant cement jars so that they could install gutters and catch rainwater that way. Because the one pump in the village tended to break a lot. So we did that. And then as you know, an African, well, I can't speak for all of Africa, but in Tanzania, any agricultural volunteer also does education around HIV/AIDS or malaria. My village had a very heavy Catholic presence, so I tended to stick mostly towards the malaria edge. So we did events around bed net repair. Just a lot of education about how malaria goes through the mosquito cycle and things like that.
I can jump in. Let's see, what did I do? So kind of similarly, one of my side projects was in kind of health education. There was a program that was set up by Peace Corps Panama volunteers called Elige tu Vida, which means like choose your life. And I was situated in kind of a whole county, a whole region that had recently gotten a road in the last 10 years, had gotten electricity in the last 10 years. So you had this entire new generation of teenagers that were going in and being able to go to high school in the city. So we ran this 4-day program in 7th and 8th grade classrooms, in which the first part was about careers and goal setting. to kind of just help get that process ready for going to high school, maybe choosing a career outside your community. What does that look like? And then the second half was a like healthy relationships and sex ed curriculum, which was really cool and like a little spicy in my community to bring that up. But that was a really cool side project I did. I also worked with, there was an economic development organization that was coming into my community and leading women's educational programs that I started going to when I first got to site because I like didn't know what else to do. So my host mom was like, come to this thing with me. That was all about crafting. So they would have a section that was like, for 8 weeks, you would learn how to make these traditional hair ornaments. And then there was like a makeup section, some other things, and they kind of eventually stopped coming. But I'm pretty crafty in general. And I had picked up a lot of like recycled craft art from other Peace Corps volunteers. So I just kind of tacked lessons onto the end of that and started this women's group where we were making hair ornaments out of like old plastic bottles and stuff.
So I had two primary secondary projects that I worked on. One being I was like embedded through Peace Corps in a US-based NGO that kind of worked in a reforestation food security kind of space. And so I helped their local employees with kind of like monitoring, reporting, evaluation of their programs and somewhat like budgeting and things like that. So like those folks didn't have like training in like Excel spreadsheets. So like I helped them kind of like get that kind of stuff together, monitoring like what we were spending money on and like monitoring like the programs and things like that. And so with that program, we worked fairly closely with some USAID funded programs as well that kind of all worked in this broader food security space. And so we were able to collaborate on quite a few kind of larger scale trainings and other kind of like programmatic areas that worked maybe targeting like women's and like children's health through like extension of like what we call home gardens, so these like highly intensified garden spaces usually close to the household. So that was a big focus of one of my like bigger secondary projects. And then the other projects that I was able to collaborate on was a malaria project that was implemented. So it was called Pecadome Plus. It was a pilot program that was a combination of Peace Corps, the Senegalese government, as well as USAID to essentially pay low-level health workers to go household to household once a week during the rainy season and diagnose and treat malaria on the spot. So along with that program, my main role was as like a language facilitator. So they were trying to train local workers that were not literate in French and only spoke local language to implement this program. And so I worked closely with a couple of these kind of like field technicians and working with them on like trying to help them essentially use cell phones to record like the data that they were collecting as they went household to household. So there's like a data app that exists that if people can count to 9, they can input data as they go through this program. And so I basically just served as like a monitor for that program. So I just like followed these relays around throughout times of the rainy season and was able to just like help facilitate a project that I largely had really no like help in like creating or like implementing. It was just kind of along for the ride. And I thought it was a really fun project to be involved on.
Thank you. And really quickly, thank you for your answers. I just want to introduce Rebecca. She's our 4th panelist and fittingly at our School for the Environment, looks like, at the University of Michigan. Do you want to introduce yourself really quickly, Rebecca, and just kind of where you served in the Peace Corps and your position?
Sure thing. I apologize for being a little late. I was running a faculty meeting and we went a little over time. But I am here at the School for Environment and Sustainability, where I'm a professor in the environmental justice field of specialization. And I was Peace Corps volunteer in the Central African Republic, where I served for 3 years. And I was an agriculture volunteer. I was actually a beekeeping volunteer, which was phenomenal. So I'm happy to share more about that when the time is right.
I was
Thank
about
you.
to-
Did,
I was
did you
about
want
to.
me to? Yeah, did you want me I'm happy to answer questions about primary and secondary projects if that's appropriate, or we can keep moving as you wish.
Oh yeah, so we've gone through primary and secondary projects. If you want to like talk about the highlights about your service, and then we can like kind of keep going in the panel.
That sounds great. In a lot of ways, I would say one of the highlights of my service was the ability to transition from region to region within the country. As a third year volunteer, I moved from these Sudano-Ghanaian plateaus up on the border between Chad and Central African Republic down into the rainforests in the southern part of the country, bordering Congo and Cameroon, Congo, Brazzaville, and Cameroon. And I shifted my work a little bit from beekeeping per se to working with um, forest foragers who were gathering honey and other foods from the forest and their relationship to wildlife conservation and farming in the perimeter of the protected area that is now the Zanga Sanga Dense Forest Reserve in that area. It's a site of amazing biodiversity and patrimony. And yeah, so that's, I mean, really in a lot of ways, the highlight of my service was the transition from savanna to forest and from culture groups letting me learn different languages and different ways of being in Central Africa, because of course these countries are incredibly culturally diverse and it's an amazing education. It really helped me be a better anthropologist later in life. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone, of course, for your responses. They all sound amazing, like amazing experiences. So as a Return Peace Corps volunteer myself, and of course all of you as Return Peace Corps volunteers, we know that, every day could be, they have their own highs and lows. They could be busy or just, a little dead. What did a typical day during your service look like for you?
Should I go first? Okay, so a typical day in my service would usually start with an obnoxious loud noise. Either it would be an unripe mango falling on a tin roof of my house with a bang that woke me startled and terrified from sleep, or it would be like a male goat brushing their body up against my house and sort of snorting, and the sort of combined like smell and kind of noise would wake me up. It was really, the alarms were less than enjoyable, but I always enjoyed waking up because there was often like a view out my window of foliage and rivers, and there were often kids from the neighbors that would come in and hope that I would be buying some kind of beignets or some kind of food that I would share with them for breakfast, and they would sort of sit around quietly or playfully hoping to share breakfast with me. And then I would go to work. And if I was in the forest, that would mean working with my partners in the project locally, sometimes going up to project offices that were up on a hill where the World Wildlife Fund had their project. But as Peace Corps volunteers, we didn't live like the World Wildlife Fund staff up on the hill with a beautiful villa. We lived down the hill in the neighborhoods with everybody else. And as a result, people loved us, they really felt like we were not your average expatriate. And that was a really lovely feeling. I remember walking up and down the hill, even after dark, feeling so at home and so safe. And I remember coming back from service to graduate school in like New Haven, Connecticut, and now places like Detroit, Chicago, and having to kind of relearn being scared walking around in the dark, because I always felt like I could hear people's voices. They knew me, I knew them. It was a wonderful feeling. So it was a lot of walking around, often running meetings, sometimes going out into the forest to look at a new site or develop a new partnership. And oftentimes when I was either in the savannah or the forest traveling out for a work assignment, I would be very heavily reliant on locals that were taking me and showing me paths and sharing their knowledge of how to get to and from places efficiently, feeding me when I would travel. And so a lot of really interdependent work, yeah, either on the bees or on the wildlife conservation front, and sleeping really well at night after all that.
My day started, I guess I'll take a step back. So I lived with a host family That's not always the case for all volunteers. People have all different types of housing, everything. So in Senegal, families kind of are structured around kind of like last name, clan names. People live in larger extended compounds of multiple households that all usually have some sort of patriarchal, like familial relationship. So I kind of had my own individual household, but within a larger compound of, I don't know, I think there was about 120 people in total if you count all the children. So I would get up in the morning, I would spend probably 30 plus minutes kind of greeting all of the elders or like older people in the household, and spending time with them, drinking tea with them. It was like a pretty common practice. I would then eat breakfast with like the children in my household. We would drink corn porridge pretty much most days, sometimes rice porridge. And then from there, I would generally, depending on the season, I would say my most common day-to-day activity would be going out with farmers to their farms, kind of seeing what they're doing, asking questions about like what are their goals, wants, needs, and then kind of like figuring out more or less like a plan of action with them of like how do we actually meet the goals or wants that they have for their own like personal objectives on their farm. Other times of the year, it would be very heavily focused on actually like implementing trainings or like planning those trainings as well. And then generally like dry season activities, there was a lot of downtime, like people weren't really farming. It's a lot of times we would work on secondary projects. So after kind of doing that in the morning, lunch would usually roll around like early, I guess, middle afternoon-ish. Most folks didn't do a whole lot after lunch for the next preceding hours because it was quite hot during the year. And then sometimes in the evenings, people would return back to work, like farming activities, whatnot. But usually, generally at that point in my day, I was just spending time with people in my community, spending time with my friends, drinking tea, just kind of hanging out and being a part of the culture, and then dinner, and then kind of same thing in the evening as well. We didn't have electricity in the village I lived in, so kind of after dinner when it got dark, we would just sit around fires and just like hang out and talk and have a good time. And then people kind of went to bed pretty early because sun goes down at like 7:30. You're just sitting in the dark after a while, and so I would go to bed at like 9 probably most nights.
Oh, do you want to go, Stevie? Okay. Let's see. I think kind of similar to Rebecca, my day usually started with some sort of like incident. I lived in a house separate from my host family, but it was like a tiny little house in their backyard. And sometimes I would wake up on my own. Sometimes someone would wake me up. I had like a water spigot that came out of my yard kind of, but we didn't have constant water access. And it would turn on at like random points. So sometimes in the middle of the night or the early morning, someone would like yell that the water was coming and I would like get my hose and like fill up all my buckets. So that was a common early morning activity for me. And usually I would say the most common thing that I did in the morning was head to school. So I'd wake up, I'd have a cup of coffee, sit on my porch, eat breakfast. I would usually like fry some corn-based good for breakfast, take a bucket shower. And it was always really challenging to figure out, especially when I was going to school, like skinny jeans were really professional at that point where like people would be like, okay, you go to school, you wear like skinny jeans and your Peace Corps polo and like, I don't know, but it was always I don't know. I never got the hang of like getting out of my bucket shower and into my house, into my skinny jeans without getting something dirty or like getting too sweaty. And so that's like a puzzle one of you will have to solve someday, maybe. But, I'd usually go to school, even if I wasn't teaching, it was just kind of a community space. So I would go, someone who I needed to check in about with something would be there. And then I would the school was on the other side of town. So most afternoons, school went to like noon. I would just kind of meander back to my community. I knew, what I was told very early on in my Peace Corps experience is if you need to get somewhere on time, add 45 minutes to your journey, because such a big part of Panamanian culture, and I think a lot of other cultures where Peace Corps is like you pass by someone's house, they yell out to you, you talk to them, you have to come in and talk for 15 minutes. So I usually just kind of made my way back to my house and like had a lot of like cups of juice and bowls of rice on the way. I usually came home with like a bunch of plantains or some mangoes or some, I had such a generous community that would give me so many things as I came home. And then I would always say I would go out again, like in the late afternoon, and I never really did because it was really hot. But, sometimes I would be having events, organizing meetings, and I would hand make a bunch of posters and I would put them up in the stores and the churches in town. Sometimes I would just like go to the store to like get a Coke and like hang out with people. Then I would have my evening in my home. I had a bunch of host kids in my host family, and I like very early on was like, I want to bond with kids because like they're at my language level. I brought a bunch of games, which was great, and then kind of tormented me for the rest of my Peace Corps service because my host family loved Uno so much. I think that I maybe spent like 400 hours playing Uno during my service. My host brother at like 7:15 p.m. would come over. He was 12. He'd come over every night, ask me to play Uno. Did not matter if I pretended I was sleeping, if I said I had work to do. And then I would play Uno for like an hour and a half. And then I would also, usually be in bed by 8:30 or 9.
Yeah, I was in teacher housing on the primary school property, and that was quite a shock actually for me to come back to the US and not have like this whole house all to myself anymore. Like this is the biggest house I'll be able to afford for quite some time in my life. But our bathroom was out in the back. So usually I would be woken up by like a herd of small children running past my window. And it's not like you close your blinds or shutters or anything because it's hot. So I would have the herd of children run by. And because we were about 7 degrees below the equator, like the sun rises and sets at almost the exact time. So we'd all get up at like 6 o'clock in the morning and leisurely make my coffee and have my bucket bath. Try and figure out, yes, of course, how to walk across the dirt yard to my room and then somehow be clean. It's really quite amazing how clean everybody else ends up being. You can always spot the Peace Corps volunteers sometimes because they're not the cleanest one in the village. But we had coffee. We had the Tanzanians have this lovely thing called a mandazi, which is like a donut almost. So I'd buy that in bulk. And then like I didn't have anywhere to go really, so I would just kind of wander around through the farms and talk with farmers and see what they're doing and what they're planting. Really work on my Swahili. I like the 45 minutes thing because that was you always had to greet everybody 3 times in 3 different ways. So it's always like, hey, how are you? How's your family? How's the garden? How's each person requires 3 greetings, and then you go home with like. You have to go home with a vegetable or, a pumpkin or something. I'd always make sure I had my backpack with me. But then I just wander through these, masses of farms because everybody walked miles to go to their farms. And then I'd usually spend dinner with, I call her my mama. She was like the woman in the village who adopted me. So I'd walk over to her house and we'd have dinner, and then it would get dark and I'd go home. I did not know Swahili. Actually, I think that's the reason they sent me to Tanzania, is because Swahili is, this is going to sound like it is a generality, but it is one of the easier languages to learn. So I think that's why they sent me there, because I had no prior language experience, none useful. Latin didn't really get me far.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for sharing. I love hearing about days of Peace Corps volunteers because truly Every day looks different, no matter where you are. And we're gonna switch around the order just a little bit, so bear with me, panelists. But can you guys talk about the work you're doing now and how your experience influenced that work, and a little bit about the career path you took following your experience in the Peace Corps, like directly after, and like kind of how you got to where you are now? And whoever wants to start, jump in.
I'm happy to start just because I'm in transit around campus and I'm afraid of dropping off. And so I want to say put in my 2 cents worth. I applied to graduate school from my post in an old Advent calendar envelope. I had a series of applications that people had brought to me. Some of them weren't even for the right academic year. So I wasn't sure they would work. And I remember going home to my grandparents' farm in Missouri and waiting to hear from grad schools. And I was so, I was not well physically. I had not been careful enough. And it turns out I had malaria and schistosomiasis and a few things. But also I was just readjusting to be back in the States after 3 years. What was kind of amazing is that around that farm were a lot of, frankly, there were a lot of Vietnam veterans, and they understood what I was going through. They and their families cooked for me, checked in on me, helped me with my grandparents' cattle, because my grandparents were in Arizona. And I just wanted a place to go and be alone and wait to hear from grad schools. And sure enough, I got into lots of them because I don't think they'd really had anybody apply from the Central African Republic before. And they thought it was an interesting thing that I wanted to go back there and do more work. And clearly I could do it. I had just lived there for 3 years. So I did a PhD in cultural and environmental anthropology. And I had a choice of grad schools, and I chose one that also had a very strong forestry and environmental studies school, because I could see from my Peace Corps site that biodiversity and climate change and their protected areas were becoming a really big thing. And that was going to shape the lives of the people who I now thought of as family in CAR for a long time to come. And I wanted to understand more about how that was all going to happen. So I spent about 7 or 8 years as a PhD student, and I got a Fulbright grant to go back to CAR for field work. And one thing I'll say is that if you have an opportunity to go back to the places where you served in any capacity, visiting with a update on your own life and a sign that you still care, it can be an incredible experience. People were so thrilled that I came back and stayed engaged. And to this day, I've welcomed children of my field research assistants and associates here in the US when there's been civil conflict in CAR. And I feel like there's a strong sense of partnership with a lot of the people who cared for me there. And I continue to care for them where I can in this world, this crazy world where all too often, like, our sites feel very far away. I also was mindful that I was kind of exploiting my experience there as raw material for my own academic career. I really did. And I became a professor. I became a professor who did fellowships in international and area studies as a person who knew about Africa. I hopped up the East Coast from New Haven, Connecticut to Boston. And then I ended up with a teaching job at McGill University in Montreal, which I loved because there were a lot of people from the French-speaking African world who came through McGill and through Montreal because they could do their higher education in French. So I felt like I was able to serve that same region at a different level, no longer doing rural development and agriculture work, but working on larger grants around agricultural development and conservation. Today, I've moved from McGill to the University of Michigan, and I still work on large collaborative grants a lot that are looking at, right now I'm working on grants that involve solar catalysis for producing ammonia for fertilizers for farmers who don't want to rely on big agricultural inputs, who want to use renewable energy. I'm working on grants that have to do with water justice. I'm bringing water professionals from West Africa, Gabon, and Cameroon to our university to learn about water testing, water quality, the prevention of pollution of waterways, because the African continent is pretty water stressed, and the countries like forest countries in Equatorial Africa have a lot of fresh water. So I think that what my experience is that I'm trying to give back to those same regions for the value that they gave me in building a career. And I'm trying to do it in a way that is fun and real and, you know, not patronizing, because these countries have some of the strongest, you know, populations of young educated people seeking education. They have emerging economies, and they have a lot of their dance cards are very full with Chinese engagement. And so I just need to bring value to these places, and I'm continuing to try to do that. And I continue to try to be so grateful for the value they gave me all the time as a researcher and a professor, and also an advocate for these areas. Thanks.
I mean, I can go next. When I came back, I mean, the readjustment is real. I remember just waking up and being terrified that I didn't have my bed net around me. Like that was like that comfort of the bed net was really weird. And just being shocked by like how big a bell pepper was. And I joined, so I did AmeriCorps State and AmeriCorps Vista when I got back. That was how I kind of readjusted and learned how to work back in American culture, which, you know, is very different. You know, timeliness alone is incredibly different between Africa and the US. So I use that to kind of adjust me back into society. But I mean, what I do now is basically what I did in Peace Corps. I work the Garden Project and the Greater Lansing Food Bank, and I work with refugees. I did refugee resettlement for a while, and then I moved to the Garden Project. So I wake up at 6 o'clock, I drink my cup of coffee, and then I go wander around a garden and and I talk to refugees about how they garden. Because a lot of refugee camps are in Tanzania, the Swahili actually became kind of important, and I still use it almost every day. So Peace Corps gave
Stevie, you
maybe I'll
cut out
just
right
jump.
now. Yeah, that'd be great, Chad. And then when Stevie comes back in. All right.
Yeah, I'll jump in now. So what do I do now? So I serve as a research associate with what's called the Forest Carbon and Climate Program in the Department of Forestry at Michigan State University. I also moonlight as a PhD candidate in the department. I'm trying to finish up my PhD studies in the near future. But kind of to speak to what Peace Corps did for my professional career, in a lot of ways, it was like almost everything. It was incredibly influential in guiding me, and not just worldview, but also my professional career. So when I returned to the US after Peace Corps, I worked as a research horticulturist for the second time at a botanical garden in Florida, where I'm from. So I grew orchids for like a year and a half again, and like assisted on like botanical research programs, education outreach. And during that time, I applied to graduate school. I enrolled as a master's student here at Michigan State. I was awarded a USAID food security fellowship for my master's studies, where I was able to go back to West Africa for 9 months and conduct more or less an ethnographic study of agroforestry systems in the area. And that was incredibly informative. And I was able to obviously reconnect with people and also build more professional collaborations and connections with people in Senegal. After my master's degree, I worked at MSU briefly, and then I started a PhD program along with starting my work with the Forest Carbon and Climate Program. Primarily what I do day to day now is I'm an ecosystem modeler. So like I'm an ecosystem ecologist by training. And so I more or less explore how do our forests interact with our atmosphere through the carbon cycle in predominantly human managed spaces. On top of that, I also help in the development of education materials for practitioners in the forestry profession, both domestic and internationally. I also teach 2 courses for the department. So I teach forest ecology and renewable wood products for the Department of Forestry. And then the other kind of large program that I collaborate in is it's called AFR 100. It's a UN-funded program that MSU is the main sponsor program on, where we're helping essentially build a model to help sub-Saharan African states quantify and account for carbon in trees outside of forests, so trees that we find in agricultural landscapes. So with that, I work with a team where we're developing like a machine learning model, as well as field methodologies to actually both implement our training data as well as training of field crews. So like my role in this project is actually the field crew training. So I will, I guess, in a couple months leave for a while and go to a couple different countries and collaborate with a variety of NGOs and government actors on training these field crews to actually go out there and implement this methodology to ideally help these countries meet their Paris Climate Agreement contributions. So it's a lot of primary research. I write publications, but also a lot of education. But generally, Peace Corps has definitely kept my foot like in both domestic and international circles, and has allowed me a lot of skill sets, language-wise, cultural-wise, to be able to collaborate successfully with international collaborators. So, wait, there's a question, Ivy, how long did it take to get a job once you got back to the US? Or some of you applied while at the end of your service. I basically went back to the same job I had before Peace Corps. So I took like a month off. Once I returned home right around Thanksgiving and kind of took off till New Year's. And then I started working that January afterwards.
Stevie, did you have more to say before you cut out? Oh.
Yeah, my connection is really bad, I think. So I will hand it off.
Cool. Yeah, so I think kind of coming out of Peace Corps, also to address your question, Ivy, I applied for graduate school while I was in Peace Corps, and it was really hard. I essentially did not do my Peace Corps job for like a full month because I was just like going into town to get Wi-Fi, which like is not great, but is doable depending on your situation. But I think kind of coming out of Peace Corps, I think that I was surprised by the fact that kind of my big career takeaway wasn't necessarily the content that I was teaching or working with. It was the importance of like community and culture and networking and movement building, where, you know, I came into this town, everyone was like, this girl doesn't know any Spanish. She doesn't know how to use a machete. Like, she is a baby. And like by building relationships with people, you know, I would go to someone's house, you know, every couple, like 2 days a week for a month. And then eventually they'd be like, oh yeah, my nephew has a truck. You can like, he'll drive you to town to get the materials you need. And like how those relationships were so important. I also, you know, I think that as much as I loved Peace Corps and getting to do that hands-on work, I got very frustrated by my inability to create large-scale change in the position that I was in. And that really drove me to go back to school and get a policy degree, because I just really wanted to be able to impact things at a little bit of a higher level. I'll say also that as much as I loved being in Panama, again, like that culture component was so important. I think that I was asking myself a lot of questions about the place where I feel like I can be most impactful. And I wasn't sure if that was working internationally. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to work internationally for a long time. And coming out of Peace Corps, you know, if I wanted to like buckle down and live in Panama the rest of my life, I could really get to know that culture and know how things work. But I really wasn't able to make that commitment. So I actually, coming out of Peace Corps, decided that I wanted to work in US domestic policy because I felt like I understood the culture, I understood how things got done, and I could make a bigger impact. And I was also coming out of Peace Corps at the beginning of COVID. So I got evacuated a month before I was supposed to finish. And that was a super scary time, as we all know. And I think the desire to be in the US and be close to the people I love. I mean, I couldn't physically be in any other country. No one would let me do that. But, I think a lot of things came together. So I'm a graduate student at U of M now. I'm actually a dual Master of Public Policy and MBA. And I think I applied to my MBA in my first year of policy school. And I don't think they have a lot of RPCVs in the business school program. So, I think it's similar to what I think Rebecca was saying. It was something that was really interesting and really different. And I could really, use that to make myself a unique candidate, whether that's ethical or not. And now I really focus on sustainability planning and energy planning for small businesses, local governments, et cetera. And I think, I think you can apply your Peace Corps experience to so many things. I remember my first semester in grad school, it was COVID. I had imposter syndrome. Everyone was anxious. And I was in a renewable energy policy class. And we had a guest speaker come in and they were talking about how you can install, solar turbines in rural communities across the Midwest, and how there has to be kind of you have to get enough people on board. And they were like, some days you just put on your boots and you hike out to these farmers' fields and you drink coffee with them on your front porch and you convince them that this is a good idea. And I was like, I did that. It wasn't wind turbines, but I did it. And if I wanted to do this job, I think I could. So, I think that no matter where you end up after Peace Corps, so many of your problem solving skills are just so important.
Great. Thank you so much. It's one of my favorite questions because I think it just shows how deep the Return Peace Corps volunteer community is, and just how invested they really are in their own communities still. It's really great to hear and see all your stories. We are gonna actually jump to Q&A right now just to make sure that everyone has enough time to answer questions. We do have more, so if you guys don't have questions off the bat, we can also ask more, but feel free to either raise your hand, unmute, or pop them in the chat. And if not, because we only have 3 minutes left, I'm going to ask maybe just a closing question of what advice would you give someone thinking about joining the Peace Corps, serving in either agriculture or in the environment? Or if you want to make it more general.
I think my biggest advice is just be open. A big thing I think that was a driving force of my service is understanding that the people you're working with are the actual experts. Maybe you are bringing skill sets, maybe you are bringing knowledge, but where I worked, people had been doing the same thing for thousands of years, and obviously I was not going to bring some new knowledge set that somehow revolutionized what they were doing. And so I would just say, just be open, be present, and enjoy your time. And maybe this isn't the best way to leave it, but I would say that for me, in my experience, that the work I did was it was interesting, it was engaging, but really the most rewarding part of Peace Corps was the relationships I built with my community and the time I spent with my community members. And I guess I would just leave it with, when you are serving, take the extra time to sit with your community and take the extra time just to be present in your community and live and learn there and just be a member of that society. And to me, that is one of the better ways you could spend your time as a volunteer.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Chad. Those relationships are so important and you really have to take advantage of them. I would say also, like I think Peace Corps is all about adaptability. I think that like you go in, especially with your projects, you design or you are assigned projects to fill a specific need within your community. And I knew nothing about eco stoves or construction when I left, and I didn't really care to learn that much, but I kind of had to step up to the plate and like figure out something new. And just like really bring that energy to your Peace Corps service of like, this is a service opportunity. You're there to fill gaps, even when it isn't what you want to be doing, or it feels a little uncomfortable and new.
think we lost Stevie. Rebecca, do you want to add in here? I'm not sure where you are right now on campus, but if not,
I am. I'm still in
Okay.
transit, but I couldn't say it better than my fellow panelists have done. I mean, the points made are extremely germane, and I do feel as though one other thing I learned was that one of the most important things I did was to ask people how they did things, and to ask people to explain to me the way they had always done things, and to be impressed by their answers, because they were impressive answers. And my USAID project was trying to convince people to build beehives out of, expensive timber and nails and paint, but they wove really, really great beehives that worked really well in their landscapes, and in the end were more appropriate. And so I think, this idea that, you may go thinking you can help or make a mark, but maybe the most helpful and transformative thing you can do is to value knowledges that have been systematically subjugated or marginalized, but they're actually very sustainable and they're actually very nuanced. And so the learning that happens, not just of skills and sectors and hardware, but of how to listen and how to have respect for difference in the world, are really, really helpful for the rest of our lives. And it's really different than, I don't know, maybe a missionary or a military type experience where you really do have, mandates. Because I felt Peace Corps gave me flexibility to learn and to learn how to learn. And that's a hugely advantageous thing. So thanks for this webinar, which I think is part of that too. It's starting now for everybody, and it's continuing for those of us who are panelists. So I want to thank the organizers for a great conversation, which has made the end of this busy day feel like it's really recharged my batteries. Thank you for that.
No, and thank you guys all so much for being here, and to our panelists for sharing your experiences. I know I personally learned a lot. Serving the education, it's very different. So it was really great to hear all your stories as well. If you guys have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to reach out to us and we can make sure to get those to them as well. But beyond that, I hope everyone has a great night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Have a good one.
Thank you all.
Bye.